All right, for our final Industrial Revolution topic, we're going to look at why this era was known as the Age of Invention. So we've already covered a lot when it comes to the Industrial Revolution, but these innovations in transportation as well as in communication certainly were a significant part of this era. So let's take a look at what some of those innovations were. The first thing that we want to talk about is mass transit. And even though many of you live in a relatively small town or have spent much of your life in a relatively small town, it's important to note that living in cities, even back in the 1800s, transportation was a really big issue for people. It's not easy to walk around a city. And as cities grew to sizes way beyond what anybody could possibly expect to walk wherever they needed to go, getting people from point A to point B became a really important part of city planning. And even though automobiles technically were invented in the late 1800s, one, most people didn't have automobiles during this Industrial Revolution era. But two, even once people do start to have automobiles, driving in cities was always a challenge. And you see that even today, especially in really large cities. So a lot of times cities, especially large cities like the New Yorks, the Bostons, the Chicagos, the Washington, D.C.s, constructed mass transit systems within their cities to help people get from point A to point B without having to walk a long ways or eventually drive very far. So in the late 1800s, you start to see streetcars being built in cities. You see subways being built in cities, all to help with public transportation. And again, just like the railroad, we talked about how the railroad caused a lot of movement among people, how the railroad caused a lot of transporting of goods and services, subways, streetcars, etc. Same thing. If you go to a big city today, the businesses, the real estate near stops on the subway, near stops on near the train stops, etc., is oftentimes the prime real estate. Where a lot of business is done and much of the work in cities takes place. So anyway, mass transit, a really important innovation of the late 1800s. The next is the communications revolution. You have, for the first time, people figuring out ways to communicate that didn't involve either A, face-to-face communication, or B, mailing letters. And so figuring out ways for people to communicate over long distances without actually having to be there in person. And also to communicate basically instantaneously over long distance. So you have the telegraph, which was invented by Samuel Morse, which used the Morse code in order for people to communicate. And then, of course, the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell. So those are the major inventions we're going to look at. On your graphic organizer assignment for this topic, you'll see a couple other ones. But that's all for topic 4.